Start it off here. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Friday, everybody's favorite day. I thought what I would do is maybe give us an hour or so to work on our final project today. So I think I'll do that at the beginning of class here. I'll give you about an hour, and then we'll come back and we'll do some kind of social justice stuff. Okay, so yeah, that's what we'll do. So I'll put up a screen here. I'll put a timer on so you can kind of keep track of um, how long it is. But let's go away and work on our projects, and then yeah, and then we'll reconvene and we'll do some social justice things. Okay, so I'll see you in just a little bit. Good luck working on your projects, and yeah, I'll see you in about an hour or so. Okay, all right. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning again. I hope that hour or so was helpful to get some work done. Um, but let's jump into what we were talking about yesterday. Okay. Nope, that's not what we were talking about yesterday. give me, give me 1 second. Just forgot to put the correct slideshow into the window. There it is. That looks a little more correct. I think while I'm here, I'll just do this, but not right now. Okay. So, yes. So yesterday we read that that article on race and gender oppression in the classroom, and again, it was kind of an exercise in just trying to do something a little bit more ambitious. It was not an easy article to read, for sure. Figuring out the argument may have been a little bit tricky as well, and that's okay because it was supposed to be difficult, right? It was supposed to be a little more than we normally would have done. So, if you struggled with that a little bit, that's okay and that's good. And struggle is a good thing, right? Struggle is when you sort of build more brain connections. So if you had to work at that one, that's good. Then it did what it was supposed to. But you'll recall we read through it, and I think we came to the conclusion that the argument was this, that women of color who are teaching in higher learning, who are teaching in colleges and universities, they experience gendered racism in the classroom, and mostly coming from white male students, right? And so the author of this study, Chevelle Pittman, had come to that conclusion based on some interviews that were done with faculty at her university. Again, these professors were asked, not specifically about white male students. They were just asked, what's your experience with students? And this kind of pattern seemed to develop in the responses of these women. And what we saw was that these white male students tended to challenge the authority of female professors. They challenged their teaching competency, challenged their scholarly expertise, and in some cases they threatened them, right? They threatened either their physical safety or they threatened their careers, right, with complaints or bad reviews or things like that. And so we have kind of three premises, or maybe four, depending on how you want to see this particular argument. Sorry, there's just a lot of people going back and forth, and I'm wondering what's up. Right. So we said that was our argument, right? Now, for the second question here, how does oppression affect individual? Sorry, I'm going to close this because I'm getting distracted.
Probably should save. There should be a noise cancellation thing in that class.
You think so?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very distractible. Like even when, like if you go to a restaurant with a bunch of friends and it's really loud and everyone's talking, I find it hard to listen to one person because my attention is jumping to like every conversation, and so anyway. So this was our argument, and we said that how does oppression affect individual interactions? Because we said that oppression was a societal level thing, right? It has to do with how society works. But even though how these people are interacting isn't oppression, it's affected by oppression, right? It's structured by it. And so here we see these white male students kind of acting out their internalized dominance, right? So the idea that white people are in power and males are in power, and white males have a tendency, or may have a tendency, to kind of act out that power relationship, right? So We saw or we read in the article that in some cases, they undermined or disrespected or challenged these professors. And again, there's nothing wrong with this, right? Well, some of it is. You shouldn't disrespect people, right? But the question is do they do this equally with white male professors? Right? And the answer is probably not. Some probably do, but it's probably more likely that female professors of color are experiencing these issues, right? In some cases, these women were intimidated by these students. And in some cases, white male students kind of saw their subject area or their expertise as kind of not real, right? So race studies, minority studies, that's not real. That's not the real stuff, right? That's just kind of her opinion of, what these things are about, but it's not real scholarship, right? And so they were kind of, disrespected or challenged in a number of different ways. And again, the question is, would white male professors be treated the same way, right? As far as the professors went, they were kind of feeling the effects of this internalized dominance, right? So I think we heard that in some cases, they felt fearful. In some cases, they felt disrespected. One professor said that she had to kind of watch her behavior in a way that probably a white male professor wouldn't have to, right? She couldn't be too friendly, right? Because then she would undermine her own authority in the classroom. She felt she had to work harder or one professor thought she had to work harder to convince students that the things she was studying were correct, right? That were real scholarship. And in some cases, they had to work harder to demonstrate that they knew what they were talking about, right? Whereas they felt that with white male professors, people just assumed that they did, right? I don't know if you remember, but one professor said, she said, I'm sure that a white male professor, could talk about lettuce heads for the entire term, and people would think, oh, I'm sure there's some knowledge here. He's just a little strange, kind of thing, right? So these women sometimes have to kind of work harder. And the last part's important too, because a number of the professors reported this, that it was difficult to offer proof, right? Because a lot of these things are kind of felt. They're not direct. You know what I mean? And so some of these women said, I don't know how I would explain this to anyone else, and I can't, it's not like anyone said anything. It was just this kind of feeling, right? It was just how people reacted, right? It was just you could sense people were interacting with her in a different way, right? And again, that's what makes some of this, in terms of sexism and racism, that's what makes it so difficult to kind of identify and figure out, because it's not so direct, right? I think in this article there was one professor said a student had said, he said something like, well, black people are only 10% of this country, and if they want their share they have to fight for it, or something like that. That's a clear racially insensitive or racist remark, right? That's very clear and very direct. But a lot of these other things are not quite so clear, right? Are these students interacting with these women because they are women, or because they're women of color, or are they just being jerks, right? Sometimes that's the tricky thing. It's hard to tell sometimes, right? But it is interesting how all of these professors brought up the same issue, right? Even though they didn't know that they were, right? These professors didn't talk to each other. They weren't asked about white male students, but they all brought up the same thing. The other thing that might be happening is, do you remember the resume thing? Do you remember the resume study? Yeah, and we said that probably one of the reasons why the resumes with the black sounding names weren't getting called back is because people were looking through a lens, right? So when they saw a sort of a stereotypically black sounding name at the top of the resume, they saw that resume kind of through the filter of their stereotypes about black people. But I think a similar thing is happening here, right? Because I think if you ask most Canadians and most Canadian students, okay, close your eyes and think of a university professor. Often the picture that will come to mind for them is a man, is a white man, is an older white man, and maybe an older white man who's a little kind of peculiar in some way, right? Lots of professors are a little bit odd. They're a little bit quirky.
The nerd?
It's sometimes nerdy. I had a professor who I used to get a kick out of who he'd always come into class, he'd sit down, he'd put his feet up on the desk.
Oh my god.
He'd sit there, and then when the clock was, about right, he'd pull out his pocket watch, because he had a pocket watch on a chain. He'd pull it out of his vest, he'd look at it, he's like, well, I guess it's about time to start. So anyway, and he'd start talking about, in that voice too, he'd start talking about ancient Rome, because that's what the class was. It was ancient Rome. And he was a little odd. Like, he was just a little bit peculiar. But anyway, that's kind of this stereotypical, I swear his voice was like that. We have a stereotypical image of what a professor looks like, right? And so when people sit down in a university classroom and the first day in walks an old white man who's kind of a little odd, people are like, okay, this is what a professor is, right? But when, say, a young black woman walks into the room, right, or a young Asian woman walks into the room, people, whether they kind of know it or not, they're like, oh, that's different, right? And then they start to evaluate her through what they know about women and what they know about racial stereotypes, right? So these women are kind of getting seen through the lens of their femininity, but they're also being seen through the lens of their race or their ethnicity in a way that the white men aren't, right? Because the white men are exactly who we expect, right? And when they are, we don't really notice it very much, right? When people are exactly who you expect, you're like, okay, that's normal, right? But when someone different walks in, suddenly people are like, oh, not what I expected. And they start to judge these women a little bit differently than they would white male professors, right? And these women know it, right? They can either feel it, or in some cases they are on the receiving end of disrespect or criticism, or in some cases kind of threatening behavior, which again is not acceptable and not cool. So the last question, actually I wanted to share this with you. The last question, oh shoot, can I find it? What was the last question I asked you? Does anyone have it handy in front of them? There was 3 questions that are actually I can go back here, hang on. Whoops, too far. How does this affect what we know about knowledge? Did anyone catch that? Did anyone find a way to answer that? Because I saw the answer for it. And now I just have to find out where it was. Probably not. The thing I might ask you to do, I might ask you to tell me what Chevelle Pittman's argument was. Do you think you could do that? You could tell me what her argument was? Okay. Okay. Good to know. Right. Okay. Good to know. So let me just see. I've almost found it here. It was in this section here. Okay. So it was in the section of challenging white male students challenging the scholarly expertise of these female professors. Okay. And so what it was, nope, that wasn't supposed to happen. Software sometimes glitches on me, and it's glitching right now. Okay. Oh, here. Maybe I can do this. Can I do this? Never done this before. Oh, I can. Interesting. But, yeah. I could just do a screenshot and pull it right onto the... So this is what I was looking for that. What does it say about theory of knowledge? So this is a professor who's been talking about, students disrespecting her scholarly expertise, and she says one of these things has nothing to do with her scholarly knowledge. Instead, it had everything to do with the student's perception that as a white male, he knew more than a woman of color. As a result of the gender and race privileges associated with white men as the purveyors of truth and knowledge, Kimberly reports that this white male student did not trust her ability to teach him. Both gender and race oppression are implicated in that none of the women faculty of color accounts of this type of challenge involved white women or male students, right? And so this is another important point here. I'm going to read just a little more, okay? This is it too. Sorry, just 1 second. This is the other piece of it. Okay, this is the other piece here. One of the main ways that whites and men maintain dominance over people of color and women is through their control of hegemonic ideology and knowledge. Okay. Jackman, 1994. I assume that's not Hugh Jackman. Might be, but I don't think it is. So what they're saying, and we've said this before, is that one of the ways that dominant groups have power is that they control social messaging, right? They control ideology. They control what's cool and what's not. They control what is knowledge and what is not knowledge, right? And so here, Jackman, 1994, is saying that these white male students feel that, they kind of know more, or what they know is more important than what these professors know because of who they are, right? Because what is and is not knowledge is kind of defined by white people. And so for these women professors of color, their knowledge and their class material, sometimes, about race or minority or gender, it's seen as kind of not real, right? It's not real scholarship. It's just her opinion kind of thing. And so I realize this is kind of difficult to describe, but it is worth pointing out, right? Is that sometimes the things that we see as real or important or legitimate or correct, those are kind of defined by the dominant group. They're not defined by the minoritized group. Okay? So, let me just get rid of that. Oh, I lost my little... Or did I? Oh, there we go. Okay. Not sure what happened there. All right. So, the question, of course, is why? Why do some of these white male students act the way they do? Okay, why are they? Why do they feel that they know more than these professors? Why do they feel that they have the right to question their authority or question their teaching competency? Why do they feel like it's okay to threaten these women, right, or intimidate them? And part of the answer is what we just talked about, right, the control of knowledge by the dominant group, but it also has to do with their socialization, right, and stereotypes and their sort of internalized, um, their internalized dominance. Okay, so let me give you some examples. Let me explain this. Okay, so often what happens in a society is that dominant groups get the message that their perception of the world, their feelings about the world, their values, their beliefs, their experiences are kind of the correct ones and the real ones, right? We said, really in the very first week of this class, we said that the idea of positionality was important, right? The idea that you don't see things exactly the same way as I do, right? Every person sees things a little bit different based on who they are and where they're coming from, right? And society will treat them a little bit differently as well, right? And so for white people, and particularly for white males, they get a lot of information, they get a lot of social messaging that their version of reality, the way they see things, is actually the right way. Okay? Let me give you some examples here. So if you look at a selection of media, and all these are TV shows, these are all very popular television shows, right? You might watch some of these, you might have enjoyed them. I've watched probably a number of them, not all of them. Any favorites here?
I don't think I've watched a single one.
No.
Probably Simpsons.
Simpsons, yeah.
A little bit Walking Dead. I can't remember.
Walking Dead, yeah, it's kind of scary though. Game of Thrones, no? No? Big Bang Theory's in there. What about?
I don't like watching TV, like adult TV shows. I'm
No?
still like stuck in the kids side.
That's okay. Kid shows are good too.
I still like Mr. Bean.
He's funny. The one where, oh gosh, I think the turkey one is the funniest one. You see him where he tries to make the turkey?
Oh, he caught his head. There's this real life one on YouTube. The one where he became a pastor. Oh, all of them is funny. I can literally mention every single episode. Like it's stuck on my brain.
He is funny. He's really funny. Although I think his Mr. Bean character, it's Rowan Atkinson, right? I think his Mr. Bean character is like the least funny thing he does. Like I think he's super funny when he actually talks. Like when I think he's really funny, but he's still funny. Like he's funny in everything he does. But anyway, sorry, I'm getting off track here. So here's lots of popular television shows from the past few years. But if you look, a pretty vast majority of these shows are the stories of white people, right? White people are the central characters, right? Or most or all of the main characters are white people. Sometimes you have a person of color thrown in there for, the diversity, to show they're being diverse. But most of these shows are kind of for and about white people. And again, that's starting to change, right? We're starting to see new shows come out that are much more diverse and have people of color in lead roles. But in the past, it's been, stories that are written by and for and about white people, right? And so again, it would be very easy to think that your version of reality, your kind of view of life, is the correct one because everything you watch on TV reflects a similar approach, right? It reflects people with similar values, right? Yeah, very popular. right?
Oh, I love that one.
Yeah, don't you? But it has been criticized in the past is that it's not very diverse, right? Are there any characters, are there any people of color on this show? I'm having a tough time thinking of any characters on this show that are not white. Boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands, wives, just random characters that show up in the coffee shop. Like, I can't think of any.
Here, now that you said, I also realized.
Yeah, it's a very white show, right?
It's funny though.
It is funny. And again, like, I'm not trying to destroy Friends because it's a classic television, television show, and people seem to be, like, its appeal continues, right? So it was huge in the 90s, and even today, lots of people like Eunice. You watch it and you like it, right?
The jokes are funny.
Yeah. Pivot. Pivot. Pivot.
My favorite's Joey.
You like Joey?
Wow.
He's fun. Okay, but still, it's a very white show, right? Here, if you look at animation and cartoons, I know this is pretty old, but look at the Justice League of America, right? There are no people of color here, right? Unless you count, where is he? Is that Martian Manhunter? He's green. So they've got a green guy in there before they can get a black guy in there, right? Which is kind of, surprising, right? And what does this say? That heroism is white? Justice is white? Right? I don't know, right? How can we not have any non-white characters in this Justice League? Right? And again, I know things are becoming more diverse now, but in the past, not so much, right? These are all white people. This guy, yeah, here's Jesus, right? Portrayed as a white man, right? Long, flowing brown hair, very handsome, white robes usually, right? This is usually how we see him portrayed, yes? Something like this. But it is kind of interesting to see him portrayed as a white man because he probably wasn't really a white man, right? He came from the Middle East, right? He came from Palestine. And a number of years ago, some scholars...
Really?
Yeah, that's where he's from, right? He was a Jewish man living in Palestine.
Oh, I didn't read the Bible enough then.
2,000 years ago, yeah. And so a number of years ago, some scholars got together, some scholars, some artists, and they kind of worked out a picture of what a typical man living in that part of the world at that time in history might have looked like. And what they came up with was something more like this. So we don't know if this is what Jesus looked like. There's probably about 100% chance that he did not look like this. But this is much more typical of what Jesus would have looked like. This is a much more typical looking, Middle Eastern, Palestinian, Judean man from 2,000 years ago than this, right? He wasn't a white man, right? He was probably much more similar to this man than to this man. But yet, sorry?
No, it's fine.
But this is how we see him portrayed, right? We see him portrayed as a white guy, right? But again, historically speaking, he probably wouldn't have been a white guy, right? He probably would have been a darker skinned man, more similar to this,
I
right?
just realized that.
Yeah, right? If you look at lots of paintings from the Renaissance and from before and from after, you will see not only Jesus, but biblical characters, saints, all portrayed as white people, right? Who are these people? Yeah, Adam and Eve, right? So the Bible describes these as being the first people that God created, right? He creates Adam, and then he creates Eve, and he sticks them in the Garden of Eden here. But this artist portrays them as white people, right? And that's an interesting suggestion, right? That they're white, because people from the part of the world that we're talking about are not white. They're not European, right? They're Middle Eastern. The Garden of Eden is supposed to be, the Bible says it's somewhere, I think, between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And that puts Eden somewhere in the middle of modern day Iraq. Yeah.
So there is white. So for example, if you see me grandma, she's white.
Yeah.
If you look at her,
Yep.
her skin is really white. So there is different, like, it's not like
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
I don't think I can tell you like a specific color for us, because we have like brown, we have dark colors.
Yeah.
For example, me and my twin,
Yep.
my sister, she's my twin, and her skin is so like darker than mine.
Yeah.
And then there is different, like I don't think, I don't know.
Yeah, and the point I'm trying to make is not that, not that people from a certain part of the world are all the same color,
Yeah.
or that we, that we even,
I think, for example, in other countries there is certain color. For example, like India, mostly the majority of people are brown, right? But for Syria or like Middle East, I think it's all mixed together. Like there is dark, white, like
very,
so like mixed. I don't know.
very true, right? But here, and that's not, yeah, again, I'm not trying to argue that, this is probably the last thing I should say because we're running out of time. I'm not trying to argue that, people from a particular part of the world are all a certain color. I'm saying it's interesting to see the first two people portrayed as white people, right? And these people look very white because, Eve almost looks like she has kind of reddish blonde hair, which is not very typical of the Middle East, right? And Adam here looks like he has kind of reddish brownish hair as well, right? Which is much more common in the UK and in kind of Western Europe. And so this is kind of a very Western European version of the Adam and Eve story, right? And so again, it's interesting to see these kind of biblical characters, or even the Son of God, portrayed as a white person, right? And again, especially with Jesus, because it's highly likely that he didn't look like that, right? It's much more likely that he looked like this man here, right? And again, we don't know what Jesus looked like, but I invite you to think about what it means for power differences in society when your group is identified as being the same as Jesus himself, right? What does that do when, the Son of God, right, the creator of the entire universe, looks like your people and doesn't look like other people, right? How does that kind of support power differences in society? And maybe not in an explicit way, but maybe in kind of an under the surface sort of way. Right? Just something to think about. Okay, that's all the time we have. Sorry, I went a couple minutes over. Have a nice weekend. I'm gonna mark your sources things on the weekend, so you'll see those come through. And then next week we'll finish racism, and I'll show you the last few things that I have to show you in this course. Eek! Eek!
Is this the last assignment, like for the presentation? Don't give him ideas. I don't wanna.
No. We won't do any more. There's no more assignments.
I wanna do more because I'm failing already.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of time left, so we got to focus on what's left. Okay, see you on Monday there, people. Have a good weekend.